More than 3 years have passed since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but still been no result. The more time passes, one question keeps coming back. What if Russia cannot fully defeat Ukraine? Will it still influence Ukraine? If yes, then how much influence can Moscow still have over the country's land, politics, economy, and future? In this video, we are going to discuss everything in this topic. The video is going to be a little long, but I hope it will give you a very deep insight into this incident, so let's begin the video. The truth is that influence is already happening on many levels: military, political, economic, informational, and diplomatic. But each of these looks different, and each comes with both strengths and limits. To really understand how durable this influence can be, we need to look at the tools Russia is using, the barriers it faces, and how Ukraine and its partners are pushing back. The most obvious place to begin is the battlefield. Russia still controls a large amount of Ukrainian land, close to 1/5 of the country. It continues to push offensives in Donbas and in the south, while at the same time launching missile and drone strikes on energy plants, railways, and transport systems across Ukraine. Even in recent weeks, analysts have reported Russia making small but steady gains in some areas. These occupied and contested territories give Moscow a physical way to shape what happens on the ground, because presence itself is power. But military influence is not only about maps and territory. It also depends on supply lines, ammunition, and manpower. Russia has been spending huge amounts on its defense budget, and its arms industry has been retooled for long-term war production. In fact, the 2025 Russian budget shows a major increase in military spending, even though the economy is under strain. On top of that, Moscow has been looking for outside help. For example, repeated reports confirm that North Korea has sent large quantities of artillery shells and missiles to Russia, especially in 2024 and 2025. These supplies have eased Russia's shortages and allowed its forces to keep fighting at the front. When there are shells to fire, the war of attrition goes on. Still, battlefield control has clear limits. Holding large areas of land is extremely costly. Occupied regions need soldiers to guard them, supply chains to feed them, and administrations to run them. On top of that, Ukrainian forces and partisans regularly strike back, which forces Russia to commit even more troops and resources. Ukraine has already shown that under the right conditions, it can recapture territory, as it did around Kharkiv and Kherson earlier in the war. And as the conflict drags on, both sides face the same difficult math of losses, replacements, and production. Gaining ground is one thing, but holding and fully integrating that land is a much bigger challenge. This is where Russia has tried to use another lever: administration and law. Since 2014 and even more after 2022, Moscow has worked to remake the occupied areas in its own image. It has handed out Russian passports, replaced local authorities with ones tied to Russian ministries, changed school curricula, and shifted media to Russian outlets. The Kremlin has also promised big budgets for developing these annexed areas while forcing people to accept Russian legal status if they want to stay. All of this is designed to make the annexed regions look and feel like normal parts of Russia over time. That kind of institutional control matters because it creates long-term obstacles for Ukraine. Think about schools, pensions, property records, or healthcare systems. If Russia succeeds in replacing Ukrainian systems with Russian ones, undoing that will be slow, expensive, and politically complicated. Money and trade give Moscow another way to extend influence. Western sanctions and Russia's cutoff from European markets hurt the Kremlin's economy at first, but in response Moscow turned east, especially toward China. Gazprom has expanded gas sales there, and new projects like the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline are being promoted as long-term solutions. These energy deals are supposed to give Russia a stable flow of revenue to fund the war and the state. By redirecting trade toward Asia and the global south, Russia has found ways to soften the immediate blow of sanctions, at least when it comes to oil and gas. But sanctions are still taking their toll. Billions of dollars in Russian assets remain frozen abroad. Access to Western technology and finance has been cut off, slowing down parts of the economy and blocking modernization. At the same time, occupied Ukrainian territories need investment. Roads, schools, hospitals, salaries for local employees. All of that costs money. Russia has been forced to pour funds into both the war effort and occupation, while trying to shield its own people from inflation and shortages. Balancing these priorities creates constant pressure on Moscow's economy. Social control is another piece of the puzzle. By handing out Russian passports and pressuring residents to take them, Moscow is trying to change the legal identity of Ukrainians living under occupation. There are also documented programs of moving people around, relocating Ukrainians and encouraging Russian citizens to move into these territories. For people living there, it's a form of forced adaptation. Accept Russian documents or risk losing access to services, jobs, and even legal rights. Over time, the goal is to create a generation of residents whose lives are organized entirely under Russian rules. Yet this approach faces a strong limit: Ukrainian identity. Since 2014, and especially after 2022, national pride and unity in Ukraine have only grown stronger. Polls show Ukrainians overwhelmingly rejecting concessions to Russia, and the idea of compromise is less popular than ever. This resilience fuels mobilization, resistance movements, and ensures that any Ukrainian leader considering territorial concessions would face heavy political costs. In other words, even if Russia changes documents and schools, the hearts and minds of people are much harder to rewrite. Beyond territory, money, and people, there's also the realm of information and cyber warfare. From the very start of the invasion, Moscow has relied heavily on cyber attacks and propaganda. Ukraine has faced cyber strikes against power grids, government databases, and communication networks. Russian disinformation campaigns aim to lower morale, create distrust, and spread the idea that Ukraine is weak. In 2025, missile and drone strikes on power plants have gone hand in hand with this information war, amplifying the sense of vulnerability. This digital and psychological front is part of how Russia tries to maintain influence without boots on the ground. Diplomacy and international politics complete the picture. Russia uses its veto power at the United Nations and its relationships with countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America to block or soften global pressure. At the same time, Ukraine's survival is heavily supported by its allies. By mid-2025, Western aid, military, financial, and humanitarian, adds up to hundreds of billions of dollars. The United States and the European Union remain the largest backers. This outside support is what keeps Ukraine in the fight and able to rebuild. It is also the single biggest factor limiting how far Moscow can go in turning battlefield gains into long-term political control. This brings us to the core paradox. Russian influence in Ukraine is real and multi-layered, but it is also fragile. On the one hand, Moscow benefits from holding territory, from its willingness to spend heavily on the war, and from finding new trade and supply partners, even as far away as North Korea. These things allow it to keep the war going and to impose control locally. On the other hand, Russia faces serious limits: economic sanctions, the huge costs of occupation, dependence on China as a buyer, and above all, Ukrainian resistance combined with Western support. Experts see this situation from different angles. Some highlight Russia's ability to adapt and to push through long wars, pointing out that Moscow has the resources and the will to keep fighting. Others argue that Russia's soft power in Ukraine has collapsed, and that civic unity, along with allied aid, makes full Russian dominance impossible. Both views capture part of the truth. Russia can certainly maintain influence in some areas, but turning that into stable, legitimate control across Ukraine is far more difficult. Examples help show this clearly. Russia's policy of passportization, for instance, may slowly tie residents to the Russian state on paper, but it takes years of resources and leaves deep resentment behind. Meanwhile, shipments of artillery and missiles from abroad gave Russia a quick boost on the battlefield, but only temporarily. One tool works in the long term but creates resistance, the other solves short-term shortages, but does not change the bigger picture. In the end, the question of Russian influence will be measured in concrete indicators. How stable are the front lines? How much new ammunition is Moscow getting from partners? How strongly are sanctions enforced? How deeply has Russia built administrative systems in occupied areas? And above all, how long and how strongly do Ukraine's allies continue to send weapons, money, and training? When allied support is steady and large, Russia's influence shrinks. When that support weakens, Moscow's room to maneuver grows. So, will Russia maintain influence in Ukraine? The honest answer is yes, but only in certain limited ways. Moscow can control land it occupies, impose its laws, and use its military and economy to press its will. But it cannot rebuild broad legitimacy across Ukraine because national identity, resistance, and outside support remain powerful counterweights. Russia can shape reality in some regions today, but whether that influence becomes lasting control or fades over time depends not only on the war itself, but also on money, politics, and the will of Ukraine's people and allies. And now the question goes to you. What do you think matters most in deciding Ukraine's future? Ammunition and logistics, international funding, or the unity of its people? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you found this deep dive helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe for more.